reason we wanted to start this meeting, have this meeting, was we've had discussions with Chris, I, and Dan Howe from Harwich, representatives from Yarmouth and Dennis. Now for about, I've been involved, Chris and I have been involved for 2 years, plus Don's been involved for the past year, of working together to take advantage of a regional sewer plant between the 3 towns. The benefits are obvious, having 1 sewer plant rather than 3 plants, being able to share resources in terms of operation, be not only money saving, but also, for instance, I want to, like I say this out loud, but it means we don't have a sewer plant in Harwich for this area. It goes to the Dennis because they're in the central part. But with that, it's another expense. It's another activity that we have to do, but we avoid having a plant at the landfill area. We had basically this discussion last week at the Board of Selectmen meeting, but I wanted to repeat it as well to get as wide attendance as we can get. This will be on TV, so have a item on its own right so people can view it and see it again. And this will start a series of meetings going through the town meeting as we move ahead. I want to emphasize that even though we've been meeting for approximately 2 years, it's still in progress. And it will continue in progress probably for some time while we decide what phases we want to go for. We still have discussions, all 3 towns, on do we have the right sewer routes to be most effective, to be most efficient, to save money. We've worked through some of the hard parts in terms of getting special legislation passed, which will allow us to have these discussions. We have a draft agreement on how the towns would work together. With Dave's help and Chris's and the other members, we've had intensive discussions on how to be open and transparent with that. It makes everyone nervous when you create a separate entity that has your own taxing authority. And so we've put into this opportunities to come to town, for the town to vote on each year. In principle, do we agree with what's going forward? If not, we can have continued discussions. The end is we don't have a choice. If you want to borrow money, the borrower, if that's the right term, has to have some comfort that we're going to pay him back. And so you can't have this be dependent on a single town not moving ahead, not being able to pay the bill. So we're kind of stuck with that. Discussion that we've asked Dave to go through, and what he's bringing us up on is some of the economics of this, the phasings. Where initial talk is to, because we want to keep our expenses relatively flat going forward. We had, after phase 2, we had a phase 3, which is, I'm pointing that way, I guess, north of phase 2, still in the Pleasant Bay watershed. Rather than spending money on that right now, spend money to look at some of the parts on East Harwich, so we can start to address that watershed and utilize the regional sewer plant. But we haven't, and we're still, even on, we met when, Friday? Even in Friday, we met and had some discussions on what area on West Harwich would we actually look at sewering to keep the expenses about the same and do the best job of removing nitrogen from that area. And that may change somewhat again going forward as we get inputs from you people, and those people hopefully that are watching this or reading the paper will get inputs to us. So this starts the discussion. It won't end it. We'll continue this all the way up until we get a plan that we feel comfortable going to town meeting with in the spring. And with that, I'll turn it over to, I don't know, Chris wants or Dave wants to take it over.
Thank you, Larry. David Young with CDM Smith. With me tonight, Kara Johnston's also here. Be happy to answer any questions at the end of the meeting. We did have 2 handouts. One is the DHY cleanwaters.org website information, And then there's a table you won't be able to read on the slides, so we had it printed out and side by side, which shows the anticipated funding coming up over the next few years to implement the town's wastewater program.
Where were those, sir?
They're on the chair right over there.
Thank you.
This is what we're intending to cover tonight. Status of the Clean Waters Community Partnership that Larry spoke to. Discuss the cost of Harwich's plan that's in the approved comprehensive wastewater management plan versus if they selected to join DHY. Overview of some of the key points in the DHY agreement, which is really the operating rules as to how the Commission would work. Talk about some of the next steps, and then get into some of the discussions on rephasing should you join the DHY of the Comprehensive Wastewater Management Plan that Larry was alluding to. That's the part that's really under discussion and looking for input from town representatives. So the DHYcleanwaters.org website is up and running, has all the latest information available on that website. Has the special legislation that was filed the beginning of this year and passed and signed by Governor Baker on October 11th. What the special legislation does is it allows the 3 towns to form or create the DHY Clean Waters Partnership if they choose to each pass the draft agreement at a town meeting vote. It has the latest draft agreement, full version of it. Has meeting minutes from the subgroup that's been meeting since June of 2017, of which your representatives, Larry Ballantyne, Don Howell, and Chris Clark, have put a lot of time in and participated in the development of all those documents. And then several presentations that have been given in the different communities or the 3 town meetings that have occurred. So I'd encourage you to visit that site. This is the latest flows, if you combine them in the partnership. This is the build-out flow, so each community can decide along the way how much flow capacity they want, but all the numbers we've run are based on the build-out flow. So you can see Dennis is a little under 2 million gallons, Harwich is a little under 1 million, because you're already sending 300,000 and would continue to Chatham. And then Yarmouth is a little over 3.5 for a total of 6.5, which results in 15% of the flow coming from Harwich. The wastewater would all be conveyed to a treatment plant located in Dennis at the DPW site in Dennis. And then the effluent would be conveyed back to multiple effluent recharge sites in all 3 towns. Just to refresh everyone's memory, the DHY partnership is only for treatment and effluent recharge. The collection systems stay completely within the domain of each community.
Dave, could I just comment on? Just wanted to comment that the flow going into the DHY is exactly the same flow that's in our CWM plan now. It doesn't change. We're saying it to a different location. But I want to be clear on that in case there's some suspicion that there may be some changing in what we're doing in town. It's not, just location.
Yes, no, good clarification. Your collection system does not change. How you implement it may change, but the collection system and the areas to be part of the sewer system would be the same under either scenario. Really what you're doing is instead of building your own treatment plant up at your DPW site, you're participating in a treatment plant over at the Dennis DPW. This is difficult to see, it washes out a little bit. We have boards over on the side, but this is the phasing plan for all three communities as it's currently constituted. Again, the treatment plant would be here in the middle in Dennis. The first recharge site is targeted to be at the Bass River Golf Course in Yarmouth. And then the second large one would be over at the Harwich DPW site, followed by ones up in Dennis. There's a small one also at the treatment plant in Dennis. So wastewater would be conveyed from Harwich to that treatment plant. Wastewater from Yarmouth would be conveyed. Similarly, Dennis would convey all there, and then effluent would be recharged back. So let's go through the cost. This is the summary of program cost. So Harwich, if you were to do it on your own, town only, total cost is $315, and these are in year 2022 cost. So there are memos put together that show how the costs from the Comprehensive Wastewater Management Plan have been updated since those were 2014 costs, and these are up at 2022. And then if you did it as part of the DHY program, then your O&M costs are about the same because you're conveying more over, but you do show almost $1 million in savings. If you look at the shared cost, your big savings comes about from participating in 15% of a larger treatment plant instead of building your own plant. I'm actually going to flip ahead to this one, which shows the breakdown of your cost. So the collection conveyance, again, which stays with you, is all under your control. The treatment plant and effluent recharge is what would be part of the DHY partnership, and then some stormwater and fertilizer management programs. We've also been included in some programs for your freshwater ponds. So your savings is still around $1 million, and then at the request, since you've already committed and you're already in your second phase, we've taken out the cost just to show what the cost would be going forward in your future phases. So the difference is this 60.5 versus the 67, we've taken out the 6.8 million that you've already funded to buy into the Chatham treatment plant. So that's really the main difference between these two tables. But again, about $1 million in savings overall. And that's on an annual basis, because these are in equivalent annual costs. What we've done, simplified, we've taken the capital, spread that over a 30-year bond at 2% interest, added in the O&M cost to come up with equivalent annual costs, so that's your savings on an annual basis. Again, these are on the table that we handed out, but what we've tried to do, this is the Harwich only plan, and it shows you've already bonded these costs up here. You're going to be looking at this one right here next spring to complete phase 2. But all the costs up above, you've already bonded and authorized at town meeting as implementing part of your phase 1 and 2 programs. So these are the future costs and the years that you would be requesting it, and it lines up with what the task is, what the request is. And then we've lined up, and on the table you have, they're side by side to show what the funding crest would be. Again, up above, this has already been incurred, so you really start here. So we've called it DHY 1 because you're really phase 3, but to line up everyone, all three DHY 1 for all of those. And then we plotted the two on a curve to show where the offsets are for bonding. And what you're doing is, because you pay so much less into the treatment plant in that phase, instead of building your own, which would be much more costly, you've bought in, and you're also paying a little more, which we'll get into that phasing, whether you want to spend more here or not and smooth that out. But that'll be a discussion at the end for the rephasing. But you can see we've tried to match in along the way how you're spending your costs, because that's how your tax impact curves have all been projected with your financial advisor. Again, this just shows a different curve. This is aggregating the costs as you go up. So you spend a little bit more here, that was that curve blip, but then you'd spend a lot more up here if you were to build your own, the tan being the Harwich only, and the blue being part of the DHY. Work better? Does this work?
You have to, there's a switch on there you have to turn on.
That work better? Okay. So what we're also trying to do to save cost is dovetail in, and again, I realize this is difficult to see, but we do have a figure over on the side. Be happy to walk through this. But we've met with the Mass Department of Transportation, and we've mapped all the projects that they have lined up from the Barnstable line to the Chatham line, meaning going through Yarmouth, Dennis, and Harwich, to try and line up the wastewater programs. If we can dovetail in your work with their work, they're willing to do the program, and they put the pipe in as part of yours. You would pay for the pipe installation, but they would be doing all the road work, paving, police details, and all the other work. So there could be some significant cost savings to do that. So the one that impacts you first would be this area here in Route 28 in the Herring River watershed. That work is proposed to start in 2024. So that's roughly about the time that you would be in construction anyway. So if we keep in that cycle, we're pretty well lined up. Even whether you put the pipe in or they put it in, since you'd pay for it, they would come along and actually do all the street work and paving. So that would be a cost savings there. And then just to refresh everyone's memory, we're also trying to make sure you qualify for 0% interest loans. As part of DHY, you gain more points in this competitive system, and as more communities start requesting SRF, State Revolving Fund loans through the Department of Transportation, Department of Environmental Protection, they will become more competitive, so having more points, being part of a regional system, will benefit you. The town was successful in getting 0% interest loans for the sewer work going on now in East Harwich, in part because you're part of a regional program there as well, going to Chatham. So just wanted to refresh everyone's memory. It has to be nutrient related, which it is, not subject to an enforcement or court order. It has to be an approved comprehensive wastewater management plan, CWMP, consistent with the Regional Water Resources Plan, meaning the Cape Cod Commission's 208 plan, and have adopted land use controls, which you have, which really is a means of managing to the flow estimates that you have developed, and that would allow you then for that aspect. So, questions on cost?
Yeah. Hi, Dave. Good evening. I didn't want to get too far
Identify
away
yourself,
from one
please.
section. Is it not on?
It is, we have to name.
You have to speak right into it.
Noreen York.
And your name.
I didn't want to get too far away from that section before.
I was planning to stop at the end of each one, so
Okay.
good call.
Okay, so the section I want to talk about is roads, so back one. So I noticed in your last package of information, you talked about something I'm sure you've been discussing, which would be an alternative route, alternative to 28, the route that would go up Depot to Great Western instead for slight more money. I really would like to see that talked about more up front. I have trouble, having been a government employee for 22 years, I have trouble believing that things will go as planned. They often don't. And so to base our plan on the fact that we're going to get 3 towns to agree on the right plan, contracts signed, all kinds of work done, and have it done by 2023 with, no problems with permits or other things, yeah, it makes me very anxious, to say the least. And I was thrilled to see an alternate route. But I would almost like to see, if this project were going to go forward, that we just decide to take the alternate route, and don't mess around with 28 and the TIP project. Quite frankly, and I don't know if there have been any discussions about that, but putting this extra pressure on with what we're just going through in phase 2, I don't think it helps us, one bit. We had concerns about, well, if the TIP project already went by, maybe you guys would go to Lower County. We didn't know where you were going, so Lower County got voted down, so I mean, I would suggest maybe some thought go into the roads and the timing, and if we have a route for $1.3 million more, but it takes away all of those factors of stress and everything else, I'd say go for it.
Actually, you bring up some good questions, but that was actually going to be the third part of the presentation. So hold that question, and I'll try to get to them at that point.
Hi, Sharon Fleetner. Oh, yeah, all right. Okay, is that better? All right, I have a question, not related to this, but having to do with the plant itself. So I know what we talk about, the DHY, the 3 towns versus Harwich alone. And we've got such a small percentage of flow going into that. And I know I brought this up with Larry earlier. Has anybody looked at a third alternative, being if Yarmouth and Dennis built a plant, that we would buy into it the same as we bought into Chatham? Has anybody ever looked at that possibility and what that cost would be? It just seems, I know it makes sense to go with the 3 towns, but again, we have so little going into it, and we don't have a lot of say as the town itself have a lot of say into that. So I'm wondering, is that a possibility? Can that be looked at? And if not, why not? And has it been?
Good question. Let me answer it 2 ways.
Okay.
It's been discussed, but the question would be, do you think Yarmouth and Dennis would charge you anything different to buy into the plant than if you were part of the original partnership? And if you're part of the original partnership, you're actually part of the commission and have 2 seats at the 7-person table versus just being a customer and having no say on how the facility is operated.
Good point.
Second part I'll answer is you may have heard me talk previously about the Mansfield, Foxborough, Norton, the MFN Regional Wastewater District. Let me give you back to the history of that. It was supposed to be a 3-town plant back in 1985. 2 towns voted not to do it, 1 voted to go forward. Mansfield, they went ahead, they built the plant on their own. They were getting federal assistance at the time, 90%, so they put their 10% in, they built the plant. Over the next 30 years, good for the town of Mansfield, they sold portions of the plant to Foxborough and Norton along the way through intermunicipal agreements. When they all were updating their comprehensive wastewater management plans, the complaint from Foxborough and Norton was, we have no say in how this plant is run. You just send us a bill. Yes, we own some capacity, but in order to be part of the expansion, we want say in how the facility is run. So therefore, Mansfield said, fine, because it's cost effective for us to let you in and be part of a commission. They filed special legislation, created the MFN Regional Wastewater District, started in 2014, has been working great, and all the communities expanded 1 million gallons and chipped in. So now they're all happy because they're part of the ownership. They have a say in how it's run. But along the way, they were paying exactly what they would have paid had they been part of it on day 1.
So it would have been the same cost.
Would be the same.
All right, All right. Thank you for that.
Good question. Thank you. So is that it for cost? Okay, we can come back if you have others. Let me go through the agreement. Again, the draft agreement, the full document is online at the website. I'll hit some of the highlights, just the key points. There's been a lot of thought put into this, a lot of discussion through the different three-town representatives in the subgroups that have been meeting monthly for almost 2.5 years now. And we've been using the sort of the template, or we started with the template, even though there have been several changes to it from the MFN model, which started from a template of several different districts that were formed back in the 70s. Again, basic concept, economy of scale. Instead of building 3 separate wastewater treatment plants, you're building one, and you're all participating in that. So it is a separate entity, though, has separate bonding authority. So the DHY Partnership would bond the construction, and they would send an annual payment for the portion to each community. So over 75% of your comprehensive wastewater management plan cost remain with the community. Up to you to implement your timeline, your time frame. But the treatment and effluent recharge would be overseen by the partnership. It started with a 2-2-1 proposed commission and was revised along the way after receiving a lot of input from the 3 towns, and now is currently proposed to be a 7-member commission. Then it's made up of 3 members from the town of Yarmouth, 2 from the town of Dennis, and 2 from the town of Harwich. And that was in part because the other 2 towns actually realized that, you know, Harwich only having 1 member under the 2-2-1 didn't really have a lot of say, so they felt it was important for you to have 2 voices at the table, and that's how one of those switches was made. The commission members would be appointed by the Board of Selectmen or designated authority as sewer commissioners in each community. And they would work with an executive director who would be hired, most likely part-time, to do the day-to-day operations. It was also important in the discussions to try to define who could be a commissioner. So it was defined, and it's in the agreement, that it could be the town administrator, DPW director, wastewater superintendent or equivalent, a sewer commissioner, selectman, finance committee member, or a qualified town resident. 3-year terms, which would be rotating, offset initially, certainly, and commissioner could be removed as you can from any of your other, under your town charter's committee appointments. A lot of discussion under the budget process. You heard Larry say there was some hesitancy about giving up some financial control. But being a separate entity, it's like there's 351 towns in Mass. This is the 352nd community. So there was a lot of discussion on the budget process. We actually had some of the MFN commission members and executive director come down and talk how they do it. But this was put in over and above what's in the MFN agreement. And what it does is a draft budget is put forth in early November, and that has to have a majority vote of the commissioners to issue that. The commission then goes out and discusses it with the communities, different finance committee members, boards of selectmen, whoever it may be, during the November-December timeframe. And then based on their input, they could make any revisions, but ultimately there is then a 3-town board of selectmen meeting, and those attending selectmen has to be at least 2 from each town being present. But of those attending selectmen, the majority of them have to pass the budget, or it goes back for further revision by the commissioners until they come back with one. Ultimately, if it's passed by those selectmen, then it has to pass the commission by a 2/3 vote, and ultimately is then issued to the 3 towns. And it's not only an annual budget, but they will be presenting a 5-year capital budget, so there are no surprises in year 3 coming out of, geez, I didn't know you were going to bond an expansion, some 15 years out, so to speak, after they build the first phase. All these capital requests would be well-known in advance to any community going forward. Now?
So on this slide, I brought this question up a year ago when we first had the draft agreement, and I was out-talked, so I'm going to give it one more try. So on the fourth bullet down, when it talks about the January 15th, when the 2/3 vote is taken, and then the, official document is sent to town treasurers by February 1st. My problem with this is that every town administrator in these towns and everywhere else is giving their budget presentations, depending on their charter, from the middle of January to the middle of February. And this just seems like we're throwing down another impediment against those town administrators. Right now, with the things we have going on in this town, $100,000 or something like that could, be a huge debate. All I would suggest is, I don't know why we don't have that date be January 20th or something like that. Why are we setting ourselves up for failure? I just don't understand. We're at the beginning of a new enterprise. We know that the town administrators have to wait for numbers from the school that come in February. They have state numbers. They have other numbers. With this brand-new project, why can't we just start it off right so they get their numbers by around the 20th of January and make life so much easier rather than having to be guessing at it every year? It'll be the operating budget. It won't be a gigantic amount. Certainly at our 15%, it won't be gigantic. But why should we have to stress over it? This is the beginning, I just don't understand.
We can bring it back, Dave.
In all honesty, Noreen, that's the first time I've heard a complaint about that date. Town administrators, finance people have been sitting in on these meetings, and no one has complained about that date to date, so we can certainly have that discussion. I think January 15th, you will know the number.
Right.
By November 1st, you will have a very good draft of the number,
Yeah.
which is probably ahead of any of the other budgets and department heads in any community. So we've tried to meet that, and these are the dates that have worked tremendously well in the MFN, but certainly it's up to the communities to figure out what these dates
What
are.
do you think, Chris?
Yeah, I don't see that as that significant. Obviously, I've sat there for 2 years, and, the governor's budget generally comes out on January 20th, around there. So you're getting your state aid numbers by the 20th. You do have, the health insurance generally comes out around the 15th of January. So timing-wise, it's actually not bad to have that. I would obviously suggest, this is my last meeting, so I can suggest here, but I think that the more you stay in touch, an administrator stays in touch with your large cost centers. So, I usually have discussions with Bob Sanborn over at Cape Tech, with Scott Carpenter over at Monomoy, and now you just add one to the list to get a preliminary understanding.
I understand all that, but that's because you're talking about systems that have been in existence, and they have their own charters, and they have to do things by certain times. This is brand new. So why can't we start it off giving it to people by the date when the TAs are looking for it, rather than having them make the phone calls, run up to the tech, who's going to get that number from the presentation? I'm just saying, it doesn't make sense to me to have things that don't join together when you're starting a brand new enterprise.
So just so I understand, you're questioning the February 1st date, and you want that to be what?
I would like it to be January 20th.
She's questioning the January 15th should be January 20th.
No.
February 1st, January 20th. So it's only a 5-day
Yeah,
difference.
yeah. Just,
We can bring that, we have a subgroup meeting tomorrow. We can
bring it
discuss
up
that.
and see what
yeah,
people
let's hear
think.
what they have to say. Thank you.
We're not alone.
For financial votes and non-financial votes, there are certain requirements for commissioners to be present. Again, to make sure transparency, you heard Larry talk about transparency. That is throughout this whole agreement. A lot of discussion on that, so to make sure certain representatives available when these votes occur. The apportionment of the costs was meant to be simple, straightforward, so everybody understands it. Clarity was important. So it's broken into capital or operating cost. Capital costs are apportioned based on the percent of capacity ownership in the treatment plant. So if you go back to the build-out numbers, if that's truly what the communities buy into, say in the first phase, then Harwich would be paying 15% of the capital cost. The operating costs were split into two components. Semi-fixed cost, which really are like staff and overhead. Doesn't matter how much flow. If you've got 8 operators, doesn't matter whether you're getting 100,000 or 900,000, you're going to have 8 operators. So that is to be apportioned based on the capacity owned as well. And then there's a flow variable component, and that is based off of 3 items, which are the largest items other than labor, typically in a wastewater budget, and that has to do with electricity, chemicals, and solids disposal. So if you send no flow, you wouldn't pay any of that. If you send a certain amount of flow, and you would figure out what the percentage of that is versus what the flow is coming from the other communities, you would just pay your percentage of that. So if you're sending 30% of the flow, you would pay 30% of the flow variable cost. Some of the advantages, Larry ticked off these, so I'll cover these pretty quickly. Cost savings, that economy of scale, where you get to improve water quality for all the watersheds across Dennis, Harwich, and Yarmouth, get to meet the total max daily loads, the TMDLs, which have been established for those watersheds, recharge effluent in beneficial locations, since 3 or 4 of the locations are actually at golf courses, and they would put wells in and use that water for irrigating. Operate and maintain 1 treatment plant instead of 3 of them, which simplifies the operations. Having central location also allows the 3 communities to address any contaminants of emerging concern, simplifies the governance, construction of the sewers in commercial areas, some of the Route 28 areas of the first phases. And again, very important, qualifies you, gets you more points in a competitive state revolving fund loan program. So that's the agreement. Any other questions on the agreement? Okay. The next steps going forward, as outlined by the subgroup, are that, again, the special legislation was passed in October 11th. It was signed by the governor of this year. Subgroup meetings are continuing to be held monthly. There's one tomorrow, 9 o'clock in Dennis. There are local meetings going on to discuss DHY costs and the draft agreement, just like this meeting here tonight. I've been holding meetings in Yarmouth. I have one in Dennis next Tuesday. Peer review of costs agreement. There'll be another consultant about to be hired to look at the cost and the agreement, just as a 3rd set of eyes. The 3-town Board of Selectmen meeting, to have the 3 boards have one last chance to discuss the agreement. That was targeted for December, probably going to be early January now, because we want to have the peer review done before that. So it's probably going to be bumped out a couple weeks. And then the selectmen would vote to endorse the agreement, hopefully late December, early January, again around that meeting, with the goal of trying to, quote, lock down the agreement at that point, so that then the communities know, all 3 towns know they're looking at the same agreement and can be educating their voters going into the proposed April-May town meetings. Your town meeting being in May, Yarmouth has theirs in April. Dennis is in May as well. Presuming the 3 towns voted to go forward and join DHY and endorse the agreement, then the agreement would be signed most likely in June, July. The communities would submit to the state agencies. You would need to file what's known as a notice of project change to your comprehensive wastewater management plan, saying instead of building your own treatment plant, you're going to join the DHY partnership, which is mentioned in your CWMP, but wasn't the recommended program at the time. It says you will be investigating it. And same for Dennis. They'll file their final, and Yarmouth would file a notice of project change as well. Then the communities would appoint their commissioners to start the commission running. There is a earmark in the environmental bond bill from last year of $1 million that was geared towards the DHY partnership, but that's only available if the DHY partnership is formed. So that would be available to go after. Then the commissioners would select an executive director and begin the 2-year design, followed by approximately 3 years of construction and connections into sewer systems. Good with next steps?
Can I ask Chris, I have one of these too, I guess. Chris, remind me, what's in the capital budget for the design phase looking to spring as a warrant article next spring?
We have 2 in there. I think it's 1.5 million for the DHY for design, and then the second is 8.4 for contract 3.
But 1.5
1.5.
for this one,
For the design.
for the design.
Yes. Which is roughly 15% of that share. Okay, let's talk about the question on the agreement.
Yes. Well, I was curious, you mentioned the meetings with the other towns, to Larry or Chris or Dave. What's been the attitude coming from the other towns? You know, we only know our own neighbors, but, I mean, what's the, appetite for this in Dennis right now or in Yarmouth right now? What tone are their questions?
I think all 3 towns are actually very positive towards it. They see the benefits. Yes, some people still have some questions. Some people still trying to understand, the cost and how they shake out, looking at different options. One of the things we'll talk about is the actual connections in, whether shared or direct connections, which we'll talk about in a minute. But I think by and large, it's been very supportive.
Okay, that's good. Just a real quick aside back to my road question. At the bottom of the slide right before this, you had written 2 years of design and 3 years of construction. That would put us beyond the transportation project, right there, which is 2024, isn't it?
No, if you start design in 2020, you design 2020, 2021, start construction in 2022 into 2025, and they're starting that roadway project roughly in 2024. However, I would tell you that Representative Whalen had the Secretary of Transportation down here month and a half ago, brought up that, and she met with some representatives from all 3 towns, and she has promised to create a separate committee to work specifically with the 3 towns to make sure all of those projects are coordinated as closely as they can to meet the sewer schedules for the 3 towns.
Well, that's good to know, but I would still always be happier with a Plan B, but that's still good to know.
We'll talk about that in a moment. So I realize this washes out as well, but hopefully everyone in this room is familiar with it. This is the proposed phasing plan that is in your approved comprehensive wastewater management plan. You're in the process of implementing what's known as Phase 2 up here in East Harwich right now. How many have been in a traffic detour? Okay. All right. It'll get over soon. 39 will be open quickly. So what would need to be done, and Larry alluded to, is this was down in Phase 5, 6 area. Because Phase 4, you were going to build your treatment plant here. Phase 3 was to do the northern section of Pleasant Bay watershed. So if you're going to go over here to Dennis and be part of that and pay for the initial portion of the design, which would essentially be your next phase, because that would be the first phases in Dennis and Yarmouth, then the discussion has been, do you really want to do that, or do you want to go down and do something here to send some flow to the capacity you're paying for in the DHY partnership. So there have been a lot of discussions. This is on the board over towards the door, but what it does is it shows that moving your next phase down here and pushing this back one phase or 5 years so that you can send flow, the closest area, to the DHY treatment plant. This shows it in a larger scale, and it shows several options that are being considered. Larry alluded to, we've been meeting with staff, getting input from communities. Yarmouth is going through the same discussion as to how to connect and where their flow is coming. So this is really 2 items. One is, where do you want to collect your flow from initially? So the first phase, this is the area here. This is a little difficult to see. This is Herring River right here. So what we've shown so far in the cost is this area of Route 28. But that's a fairly small flow. But that would be collected in a pumping station here and then pumped either, what's shown in the cost now, along 28 over to a common pumping station at Route 28 and 134 in Dennis. And then that would be part of a DHY shared pumping station and force mains up to the treatment plant at the Dennis DPW. But we've also been looking to try to see if there's a more cost-effective means for Harwich to connect in. Same exercise going on in Yarmouth. And so we have looked at, instead of pumping over 28, because we've got to get around the work that's been being done in Dennisport, 5-year moratorium, we think we found some routes through parking lots and all, but that requires easements. So we've been looking at going up Depot Road and then coming over up into the treatment plant, which is about right here. It's about, and that memo was incorrect, I apologize for that, it's a 1.3 million savings, not additional cost, by doing that. But we met with staff, and they're concerned that new gas mains, which have recently been put in Depot Street, may create additional costs for doing that and getting around and just being tight on utilities. So we've started looking at going up, coming back this way and going up Lothrop Road and then out Main Street over to Great Western Road and then up into the treatment plant. It's about a half-mile longer, but it's more of a residential street, doesn't have as many utilities in it. So we're looking into that. Right now the cost may offset, but it may be easier construction. It's not a decision in my mind the town needs to decide today. It's a final design decision, and that can wait till the design period, because again, that's under your control. So those decisions as to how we connect in are being evaluated. You've got 3 options. What we need and what we're looking for input from is how much flow you want to collect, because that will add more cost into this next phase. By just doing this piece right here and your share of the treatment plant was the equivalent cost of what you were going to pay to do phase 3 up in East Harwich. So we tried to match into your same bonding that you had proposed in your comprehensive wastewater management plan. But because that provides only a little bit of flow, and we'll get into a table in a minute, input from town staff and representatives, we pieced out area 4, which goes here. We looked at an area 5. We added another area going all the way up here, is to try to get all the way up to 28 and include that. But then another option came about of saying, well, if we have to do this and the pumping station's here, instead of doing the expensive Route 28 work, where there are no proposed MassDOT, Mass Department of Transportation projects there that we need to dovetail in with, why don't we collect more flow and utilize your treatment plant capacity and take out nitrogen in the impaired Herring River watershed and sewer the area that was proposed in that area. and collect more flow, significantly more flow, because that's a pretty dense residential development area. So, a lot of options, and this is how it plays out. Again, I'm going to say this is preliminary because we were just asked to do some of this on Friday, so it hasn't been triple checked, which we need to do. But I did want to at least get the concept out there to try to get some input from you folks as to how to go about this. So this is the cost as though you were going to do this comprehensive wastewater management plan. Essentially, all these costs down here stay the same going across. The one to focus on is the collection system. So you were going to spend $19.5 million doing that Harwich, East Harwich area. Under the DHY, you're going to do 9.5 on that Route 28 and then convey over to the pumping station at Route 28 and 134 and pay your portion of the treatment plant. Under one option, we do Area A. Instead of 9.5, we added about $2 million more in sewering. We go to option B, we add about $8 million more. We get up to 25, we get up to 28, and then if we do that sewer area and not do much of 28, just to the pumping station, it's about 24 million. And these are the approximate flows. As I said, that smaller area is only about 40,000 gallons of capacity. If we do the sewer area, we're up around 175,000 gallons of capacity. So 40,000 by spending 30 million, or we get 175,000 for up around 45 million. So let me go back to the figure. Again, this is DHY only. This is A, this is B, this is C, this is D, and then E is if we sewer this. So I think the town is looking for input from folks as to how to go about that, because what you'd end up doing, again, your collection system isn't changing whether you join DHY or do it on your own. What you would be doing is spending $15 million more in your next phase, but collecting a lot more nitrogen, i.e. wastewater flow, and cleaning up the Herring River watershed more quickly than you were doing under the old or the former program. You want to add anything to that, Larry?
Only that, as our discussion went, we've been looking at these options because we're spending money on DHY, and we want to not only spend money on the sewer plant, we want to be sure we're removing nitrogen and addressing our regulatory needs. And what this, even though it's a little more expensive, what it does is it would meet the Herring River, remove that nitrogen, and get us further ahead on removing nitrogen. From not only we'd have Pleasant Bay going in a good direction, we'd have Herring River going in a good direction, rather than just taking a poke at it. The grammar's not good, so, but it is more money. I would also point out that we have to remember that more money is being bonded for 30 years, and so it's you know, annual payment won't be that big increase. But the question in my mind is how we do it. We want to be cost effective, but we also want to be efficient taking out nitrogen and meeting our needs. So there'll be a big discussion.
I do want to point out that those flows are the build-out flows, meaning if everything was built within that area, it's not your existing flow. We're in the process of calculating what the approximate existing flow is in that area. We didn't have that for tonight.
My turn. So this is a lot to try to take in and assimilate, you know, in 2 seconds, but I'll give you my first reaction is that it's just way too much. I mean, the town's in a financial bind, you know, and then we're talking about increasing the amount we'll spend over the next few years rather than decreasing. You know, we're stuck with the contract 3 portion of East Harwich, We don't know how the voters will vote for that, so that's 8 million that we had no intention, it wasn't in any plan, you know, that we'd be paying for. We started talking about the escalation of DHY and how that would move some costs forward. You know, that was scary enough, but then we added the 8.4 million East Harwich question on top of it. And now, so I've just taken in those two things, and I don't think we can afford those two at the same time. But now we're talking about expanding on an accelerated program when our first program failed. You know, this doesn't make a lot of financial sense to me, quite honestly, coming from the financial world. It just doesn't. And the other thing that I from a first look, this is when we're getting it, the idea about having a construction project spread across a town when we don't even have a project manager. You know, I mean, I don't even know how people could even honestly discuss these things as realistic ways to go forward myself. You know, I would still consider the DHY proposal, whatever small piece, but I don't think it's a right plan to go ahead and suggest that the town give input to taking those two debts that we didn't expect to get and look at ways to increase them, you know.
Al Rosenberg, I live in East Harwich. We are in phase 3, and I don't know whether I heard you or not at the beginning, that in order to do some of these phase 3, the revised options, whether you would not sewer on Continental Drive, which is right along Stop and Shop, whether you would not do that in order to have the funds in order to begin to do these things to get enough flow to go to Dennis. So that's a question.
Sure. Good question. Let me try to clarify. You're actually in contract 3 of the phase 2 program. I was talking phase 3, which would be the next sewer service area north of what's currently proposed to be sewered. That would be delayed 5 years under the current proposal.
Which would be delayed 5 years?
Yes, but you're in the program that will be bid in the spring and brought to town meeting this spring. So you're in contract 3 of phase 2. You're still in phase 2.
When you said 3, I thought it was phase 3. I misunderstood you.
You're in contract 3 of phase 2. We were talking
Contract 3,
pushing
phase
phase
2.
3 off.
Okay, not applicable then. Thank you.
Correct. All the numbers can be confusing.
All right, Sharon Flieger, I got another question. Having listened to the Board of Selectmen meeting from Tuesday night with Richard Waystack and talking about our debt and where it's falling and what it's doing to our taxes, I don't see, maybe this is following on to what Noreen was getting at, I don't see how we could possibly add any more to that than what we already have when we're looking at what the taxes are going up this coming year. So, although that sounds like a good idea and a good plan, I think a lot of it's going to depend on when that money is going to hit the tax rate. Now, that's going to bring me back to when I brought up about, would it make sense for us to buy in with DHY, or whether we would, you know, buy, be a full partner, I'm going to use those terms, versus just buying into it like we do with Chatham. And like you said, basically that cost would be the same. Is there a difference as to when that would happen? If we decided to let Dennis and Harwich do it on their own, if they would, whenever they would do that, and then we would buy in, although we wouldn't have as much say, would the timing of when that money is going to hit our tax rate, would that be different? Now, maybe you two could answer that. I don't know that Dave could.
Noreen's point first, if I may.
Go ahead.
I think we need a discussion. I agree on the overall spending. In my mind, I think we need a discussion on priorities between Contract 3 and DHY. Possibly we can't do them both. That if we have a priority, in my mind, may be more important to move ahead with DHY at this moment and delay Contract 3 to some point. I can justify that to some extent in that we'll be collecting nitrogen data going forwards. These are based on the best science we have in models, but they're still models. And it could be that we find out that we're more efficient in the part we're doing now. We don't have to do quite as much going forward. Obviously, the reverse of that could happen. But that would help offset some of that cost if we did one or the other and not consider. I would agree. Considering both right now is probably not going to happen. Sharon, to your point, at least one of the, I didn't at the very beginning, Chris was, I wasn't at the very beginning, but one of the initial discussions I was in with the DHY, our druthers were to follow the Chatham example because it's simpler. You know, they build it and we sign it, we build an IMA, intermunicipal agreement, and go forward. There wasn't a lot of enthusiasm for the other towns because they pick up all the capital expense right away, even though ours is a smaller amount. And so, well, enough said on that. There wasn't a lot of enthusiasm for them to build the plant and let us buy into it when we wish. And that's one of the reasons, plus the guidance of Dave and others, having this model of the other towns that had worked out that way. But we did discuss that initially because, you know, for us that live here, that's the easy one to go to. That's been successful. Chris, you know, worked hard on that, and it works. But it was a non-starter, at least in my discussion.
All right, are you referring to having more go to Chatham than what goes now? In other words, you were saying rather than going it alone or going in with DHY, would you take all of that and connect that into Chatham? Is that what you were just saying?
Chatham has made it very clear in all the discussions with Harwich that they're only taking flow from the Pleasant Bay watershed, and actually in the intermunicipal agreement, there is a diagram that shows the only areas they will take flow. And that's the same risk you would run in not being part of DHY now, is there's nothing to say that Yarmouth and Dennis would allow you in the future. So therefore, you would be on your Harwich only solution as Plan B, and you can see how much more costly that is.
All right.
So that's the risk you would take.
When you're looking at this right now, are you saying here when you're talking about going up further, are you going to is that now going to increase the like 15% flow that we're now saying, and that we're paying that portion of it with the DHY? Is that going to increase if we would do that to DHY?
No, you would be sending the same amount of flow. It's just when you're sending it. The first phase treatment plant, the costs that we've been showed the first 4 phases in each community. We added up the flow in each and said, this is what you will send. It happened to actually be very similar to the same proportions. So you were paying 15% of the first phase of the treatment plant built. They're not building a 6.5 million gallon treatment plant. They're going to build it in phases. You could come back and say, I only want 10%, and you would pay 10%. It's up to you to determine how much flow you want to buy into initially in that treatment plant.
All right, that other chart you had up where it had the one after this, that one, which is what are these A, B, C, D, and E? What are they? Because it's hard to read.
This is the DHY. This is A. This is B, the blue. This is C. The green is D, and these are additive. So this is what we show in one column. We add the next one, then we add this one, then we add that one, and then we add that. That would be your most expensive.
And those were always planned? Was that always in the plan?
Always been in the plan to be sewered, yes, but they're in Phase 5 right now, Phase 5 and 6.
And you would move those up to the
Could be
current?
your next phase, DHY 1, or Phase 3 if you're keeping Harwich.
Okay. All right, then I guess my biggest question is, and that's going to go back to Larry and Chris, how that's going to affect when it's going to hit our taxes, because I think that is going to be a very, very big question.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you need to think about in terms of financing this, Dave kind of showed the chart that shows a big spike, and that big spike is us building our own plant in Phase 4, $60 million.
In Phase 4, it would be what year, like roughly?
About 10 years from now,
All right,
okay?
That's 10
So we have
years.
$60 million to build a plant in 10 years from now. That's a huge nut to finance, okay? That was the biggest one, and that was from the original plan anyway. What you look at this is we're comparing only Phase 3, which is just the northern section of East Harwich, sewering that. And we're comparing that, but we're not comparing, because if you look at the numbers, the wastewater treatment plant, it doesn't have that until Phase 4. So you really need to think about the plant, instead of being $60 million, you move it up 5 years, or 5 or 10 years, and then it becomes $15 million instead of 60. So for a long-range financing plan, if you can take a peak off of $60 million and put it into having it only be $15 million, now you level off your debt. And the thing about this debt is, as you put debt on, over this time horizon, debt will fall off.
do we have debt that's going to fall off during that time frame?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Carol's done a lot of this, Hilltop Securities has provided these, and, the debt plan that the town has, I had it as the administrator, is you want to have consistent debt that doesn't have peaks and valleys. So what this plan does is it takes off that peak. It takes off the $60 million peak by signing up. It does go a little earlier, but from a cash flow perspective, you have to look at the full 40-year project. So you're taking a significant peak off from 10 years and moving it to a smaller, I don't even want to call it a peak, a smaller amount earlier.
It's making sense with the exception that what we're getting hit with come January. And I think what came out on Tuesday night, to me, was an eye-opener. And I think it's going to be an eye-opener for a lot of people. So I don't know, I know what you're saying with leveling off, but right now, we've got a peak. We've got a peak now for a lot of people coming January. So adding more, I don't know. I don't know where that...
I think one of the things that, finance has a lot of different components to it. One component that we had, which was huge, was we got the first payment that we have to make for Cape Tech. $900,000 added to one tax year. That's a lot of money.
Yeah.
Next year, just due to circumstances and such, we're not going to have to come up with that $900,000 again. That's now built into the tax base. So the next payments, the school payment is going to be over 20 years. That will be less than $900,000 or in that $900,000 range. So your taxes aren't going to go up again by $900,000 because the next payment is going to be, I think it's about $750,000. So you actually get a little bit of a drop-off. You can't just look at your debt structure. I mean, obviously, this is a big nut, and you're trying to find a way to feather it in. You're not going to feather it all in. There's going to be an increase. But the one thing that administration and the finance director has done is work to see how do we take some of those peaks off. Unfortunately for the Cape Tech school, that $900,000 first payment was huge.
We also have two other payments in that same time frame. Am I correct? He listed the three. He listed three that we're going to hit in January.
Well, I'm sure some of the other ones or some of the debt for these projects are obviously coming online.
Yeah, but there was, I don't remember, and I don't have the paper with me, but I thought there was going to be three, the tech was one of them, and there were two others I thought that were supposed to hit that are really going to,
Yeah, the fire
Fire
station
station
is $7 million for the fire station. That's the debt service for that coming online, and then the sewer's coming online.
yeah, or maybe those were the three. So, you know, although that tech center may be going down a little bit, you've got those other two that are hitting, and that's going to be, I don't see where that's going to level off. It's still going to go up. And now if we're talking about this on top of it, it's hard for me to imagine how the people are going to look at this, because I know how I feel. So that's just my thought on it. You're next.
Okay, just one more clarification. I get thrown off when I hear the DHY plant referred to as 15 million, because once we make the commitment to go to the DHY plant, we're also committing to, depending on the route, $12 million additional money in conveyance. So I would much prefer, when people talk about the DHY plant, they talk about it as the plant and the necessary conveyance, and call it 27 million, not 15. It skews it wrong. No matter what phases it falls into, you make that commitment, you got to have it. So it's really 27 to 40 is what we're talking about, not 15 to 40. But with that said, my question on that, well, my first question is, for future discussions for the town, can we get slides that we can read better? No, seriously, is there some way? This is really hard. I mean, can somebody look into that? It's been going on for years, you know, but.
It's the projector. If you would like to buy a new projector, these slides show perfectly well. It's your projector.
I'm surprised there isn't a projector in there. But at any rate, okay, so these amounts under A, B, C, D, are we saying that A is 11 on top of the 9, right?
These are aggregate. Those are totals. They don't add together. So if you did the A area, it would be 11.2. If you did the B area, it's a total of 17.3. It's not plus plus.
Okay, so if we were doing, I just want to understand this. If we were doing the base DHY area plus A and B, what would that cost?
17.3.
Okay, all right, so that includes the two previous?
Yes.
Okay, so it's not, so excuse me, so under the description, what it really should say is Phase 3 expansion, DHY A and B. Yeah, that's not clear. Right?
Yeah, okay. That's correct.
Okay.
A plus B, yeah.
Yeah, I'm
you're
just trying to understand, it's not, we're not adding all
Right.
4. Okay, because I thought we were for that. Okay. Thank you.
I have an easy question. Has Dennis already locked down where their pipe is going to go?
Regarding the sewer system, or?
Is it going to go down 134, or how?
Portions of the sewer system go down 134. We're looking at if if Yarmouth and Harwich don't go to a shared pumping station at 134 and 28, we may move it up to the Ezra Baker School parking lot and go up Old Main Street instead, because it'd be cheaper to go on a residential road than in the highway.
So they really haven't finalized where the pipe's going to go yet?
None of the communities have finalized.
Because it
but
makes a difference for us, whether we're going to be on 28 or whether we're going to go up Depot.
If you go up Depot, you shift more cost back to Dennis, because you're no longer sharing that force main and pumping station, of which they would benefit by sharing. You go direct, Yarmouth goes direct, they end up having to pay 100% of the costs for that conveyance system. So it actually shifts more cost back to Dennis, even though it saves you some money.
Okay.
That's what we had for tonight. Any other questions? Again, as Larry said, I would encourage others to contact selectmen and let them know your thoughts. Sir?
Hi, Gary Conroy. I mean, this is a lot of money. And I think, what these ladies were talking about is how much can the town handle without going bankrupt? I think the other thing is, what does this do to all our other infrastructure or other things that we might have on the table? So the prioritization of how we spend money becomes really, really important outside of this. But one of the other things, I hear numbers from 2 million to 4 million, no, 2 billion to 4 billion to do Cape Cod. And is there any discussion about Cape Cod possibly going to the state and try to exempt this from prevailing wage law and save a little money on labor? We're really paying Boston, Metro Boston, labor rates on Cape Cod, which is driving up the cost of these programs. If we save 10% of $4 billion, that's $400 million. It would only happen if there was a total group effort from Cape Cod and went to the state and said, we can't afford this and we need some relief. There have been examples on Cape Cod of being exempt from prevailing wage law, and I would suggest that we also look at other ways to drive costs down, and then also look at other ways to drain more revenue into these projects by getting more allocated funding through the state. Example, we just passed the Airbnb short-term rental tax. All of that money that is being taken out of Cape Cod and going to Beacon Hill really should have been driven into these programs to drive the costs down and make them more affordable for our communities. See where it goes.
I'd be interested in hearing where those exemptions for the prevailing wage law were on Cape Cod, because I'm not aware of them. Essentially, it's been brought up before at the state legislature, and it's pretty much a non-starter. Same with any of the other procurement bidding laws, filed sub-bids, all those things, non-starter. When you realize who you're going up against, it's save your breath. But I'd be interested to hear where you are aware of others.
The Marconi station many years ago. It was a $500,000 project. It was exempted from prevailing wage law, and the funding of $400,000, which was allocated, was enough to get the project.
My guess is that was all federal money.
I don't know about that, but I just learned about that this weekend in a discussion. Marconi was, pressure from Sarah Peak at the time was very effective in getting this. As a charity foundation, as Dave says, we've approached that in some of our other building projects with no luck. I'll certainly raise it again with Sarah Peak and Julian Sear to see what happens, because it would, but we've had no, I wouldn't be encouraging to say there's any possibility of getting that done, but it never hurts to raise it.
I do think there's some significance that a lot of the modeling that was done on the finance, we do 2%, you saw 2% on there, that's going through the state revolving loan fund, so doing that as opposed to going out to the marketplace probably is saving us. The fact now we're a AAA rated community is also saving the town a fairly decent amount of money. The Airbnb does have a mechanism where the money is being kept on the Cape and will be available to pay some of that down. So that is, the board's been formed and they're working on how that will be, I guess, disseminated throughout the communities. And they have an element of that the money that you put in is supposed to be similar to the money that you get. So there's an equity clause in there. They haven't worked out the details, or in the process of doing that, but none of that was included in the modeling. The modeling for the phase 2, we had 2%, it came in at 0. And then we also got a loan forgiveness, which I think the finance director reported about $400,000 worth of interest that was cut off. So I think showing people a realistic scenario is one thing, and then as more favorable news comes in, because there is some favorable news, that is then starting to pay some of that down beforehand. But yeah, I've been in this business 30 years, and prevailing wage, it's just a non-starter at the state. I mean, it's a tough nut. I just wanted to thank
Never hurts to
tonight.
ask.
I just want to thank tonight, though, Alan Thompson here from the Water Commission and Dan Pelletier, the Water and Sewer Superintendent, here in attendance. I appreciate your attendance tonight and your interest in the topic.
If you're willing to walk to the microphone.
One thing that we need to think about as we move forward is those watersheds that are under regulatory review, that they're mandated to get cleaned up, such as Pleasant Bay. So when it comes to when the phase 3 or the third section of East Harwich gets completed in this next year or two, there's another phase that's above, that is kind of in limbo to kind of get a review of the nitrogen loading in, excuse me, in the bay. So if you were going to hold off on that at a later date, and then start the Herring River phase, because that's a problem area that's under regulatory review and also brings out the Conservation Law Foundation. So it would be you would be devoting your efforts to those water bodies. And then after that, you got Allen's Harbor, Richmere and Saquatucket that are all, need to be phased in there. And then from there, it's freshwater ponds. So for me, to get the most bang for the buck and also address those environmental issues makes sense. That's where I'm...
Let me, it's a good discussion. Unfortunately, it's a balancing act. We're trying to meet our regulatory and legal requirements and also do what's right. We know our bays are not in good shape, and still, as you say, sir, not bankrupt the town. So we're trying to move this forward and be as careful as we can. And that's the whole discussion. It's not an easy discussion. I think people sometimes think we're spending this money just because we love to spend money. And it'd be a lot more comfortable if we didn't have to. But and one thing we do have in our favor is probably the only thing we control in all this is timing. We can we can move things around somewhat to help us in our capital plan. And so that's one of the discussions we have, not only as a board, but with the capital outlay. Chris has led that. So it's a good discussion. We're looking for input because we have to get people comfortable with what we're doing. We've been throwing out ideas on how to move forward and how to move ahead in a cost-effective way, but also I keep saying this in a meaningful way. I just don't want to do something not have it have meaning as well, because it's still big money. I just want to, I didn't have say this at the beginning, but I want to give great thanks to Chris Clark. He's been our town administrator. He's not only been the leader on working with us on this DHY, moving it forward, but in all the wastewater plan, a lot of other activities in town. So, Chris, before you get a chance to run away tonight, I want to make that statement. So we appreciate it.
I did want to say one thing to the point about the capital and the investment that the town needs to make. One of the things, the reason why you want to probably try to go sooner is that you have Monomoy is a 2-year-old, 3-year-old school, so that probably has a 30 to 40-year lifespan in it before significant work needs to be done. Cape Tech in the same boat. You have the harbors have all been redone. So you have a new fire station. So timing-wise, on the capital plan, with the exception of sewers, there's really no big nut to crack. And to your point, you get 20 years down the line and maybe you need a new public safety building, you're going to start to get into bigger infrastructure again. So there is a window of opportunity that you want to try to get this stuff accomplished in.
Sorry, I can't let that one go by, Chris. Only in terms of East Harwich, Southern East Harwich is 24 million, plus the 8.4 million, that's 32 million. And that construction period was supposed to last several years. So with that money, 32 million going out steadily over the next 2, 3, 4 years, I don't see the window there that you see. And, you know, then I see other projects being talked about, Allen Harbor Jetty, everything else. I don't see any window at all. I don't see any sky, so it's just.
You should read the capital plan, because it's right there. It's nothing that's hidden. The capital outlay has it.
Okay. I think David Young, thank you very much,
Thank you all for coming.
and thank you for coming.